Okay, everybody, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing here on these example problems. Okay, so basically for this one, how does each of the following affect changes in real GDP and price level in an open economy in the short run? So it doesn't say that you have to graph them, but I'm going to graph them as the explanation. Don't forget that it says that you have to explain. So not only what happens, but explain. All right, so an increase in the price of crude oil, which is an important natural resource. So remember your correct labelings, AD and SRAS, short run aggregate supply. And you got PL over here and real GDP. So when oil becomes more expensive, that's going to be an import price. So that shifts you to SRAS1, which means that our price level is going to rise and our real GDP is going to fall. Okay, so price level rises, real GDP falls because you have an increase in input prices, which is a leftward shift of aggregate supply. Okay, a technological change that increases the productivity of labor. So I'm trying to make this a little bit smaller so you can see better. So AD, we'll just call it AS to save space. So now we're going to have an aggregate supply shift to the right. So we have price level is going to fall and real GDP is going to rise because we're going to be more productively making stuff. That's a rightward shifter of aggregate supply. An increase in spending by consumers. So in that situation, we're going to have a shift of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand to the right will increase price level and real GDP. And then for D, you guys don't really know this. We haven't studied the foreign exchange market, but I told you to take an educated guess. So what you see is when the depreciation of our currency, when our currency becomes less strong, that means that foreigners will want it more because they can buy more dollars for less of their currency. So what that means is American goods will become relatively cheaper. So real GDP will rise because net exports will move more positive and the price level will rise, which is actually sort of what you want because when a country's currency depreciates, the increase in exports helps to even out the market, which is kind of what you want. If it went the other way, then that would sort of, once the currency started to depreciate, it would just sort of depreciate forever, which obviously would be a problem. So let's move on to the next one. Country's economy is in short-run equilibrium with an output level less than full employment. So we're basically going to be seeing a recessionary gap. That's what we're going to have to start off. And then assume an upsloping aggregate supply curve. So for part A, we're just going to use a correctly labeled aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph to show the following. Full employment output. So full employment, that is not where we are because we have a recessionary gap, but then the equilibrium output. So you're going to have PL and real GDP. You've always got your vertical LRAS, which whenever you're talking about long run and short run, you're going to want to have both of those there. We are going to label this YF, and then we have our recessionary gap. So this is AS, or short run aggregate supply, and AD. So now this equilibrium is going to be labeled YE and PLE. Okay, so this shows the fact that these are lower shows our recessionary gap, okay? Okay, so now assume that the country's government increases domestic military expenditures and then add on the graph from part A what that looks like. So we'll change colors, we'll go to red, and we're going to have an increase in aggregate demand because G is a component of aggregate demand. So when G goes up, aggregate demand will shift to the right. All right, so we need to label this PL2 and Y2. Okay, we're going to skip the Phillips curve for now. You don't know that, and we will definitely study it. You will know this in the future, but not yet. Assume that the Increased military spending is financed through government borrowing. So government borrowing is the idea of what will happen to the real interest rate. We haven't specifically studied the loanable funds market yet either, but I asked you to take an educated guess here. So you can imagine if everybody wants money to borrow, including the government, and then the government wants more because they're financing this big military spending plan, then the interest rate will rise. I should say the real interest rate will rise. And the reason is that the government will crowd out by demanding more funds. We'd usually call those loanable funds. Okay, now for Part E, assume that the economy produces only two goods, military and civilian goods, using a correctly labeled production possibilities curve. Show the effects of the increase in military expenditure from B, labeling the initial point as C and the new point as D. So I am embarrassed to say that this is something that I initially was not paying close enough attention to, and I actually made a mistake and got it wrong. So it definitely happens. So you've got military and civilian. So you've got C and D. C is the initial and the new point is D. My mistake was that, I just put C on the production possibilities curve. But of course, remember that we are in a recession, right? So when we come up here, remember that we are at less than full employment output. And that was my error. So that's not actually where point C is. Point C is inside the curve because we're in recession. Then point D needs to move outward and increasing military. So it matters, or it doesn't matter rather, whether you have military on this axis or this axis, just you have to show more stuff getting made, and that the more stuff getting made includes more military stuff. So you have to have an increase this way in military. But obviously if you switch these two, it would look different and still be correct. So that's that. Hope you guys are well.